There is a moment in some people's lives when the self they once trusted suddenly collapses. Not gradually, not politely, but all at once. Like a structure you didn't know was unstable, finally giving way. Beliefs lose meaning. Identity feels strange. Even memories feel distant, as if they belong to someone else. This is often described in spiritual language as ego death. But when it follows trauma, loss, betrayal, spiritual crisis, or psychological overwhelm, it can feel less like enlightenment and more like disintegration. And then comes the real question most people are not prepared for. If I am no longer who I was, then who am I now? This is where healing begins, but not in the way most expect. Psychiatrist Stanislav Grof, known for his work in transpersonal psychology and altered states of consciousness, including LSD-assisted therapy research, described ego death as a breakdown of the perceptual filters that hold identity together. In some cases, this breakdown can lead to profound insight. But Grof also emphasized that without integration, it can feel like psychological chaos rather than awakening. His work suggests something crucial. The collapse of the ego is not the same as healing from it. And this is where many people get lost. Because after a traumatic ego death, the mind tries to rebuild too quickly. It grabs fragments of the old identity, old roles, old relationships, old coping patterns, and attempts to stitch them back together. But something feels off, like wearing a familiar outfit that no longer fits. Psychologist Carl Jung, who studied ego fragmentation and individuation, described this stage as part of the psyche's necessary transformation. Jung believed that when the ego dissolves under pressure, the deeper self begins to emerge, not as a replacement, but as a more integrated center of identity. However, Jung also warned that this process can feel like inner death before rebirth. What dies is not your essence, but the false structure that once contained it. Still, knowing this doesn't make the experience easier. Trauma specialists like Dr. Judith Herman, author of Trauma and Recovery, explain that after psychological overwhelm, the nervous system often oscillates between numbness and hyper-awareness. In ego death states, this can feel like being unreal or disconnected from your own life. Herman's research highlights that recovery requires safety, stability, and gradual reconnection, not forced meaning or rushed transformation. So how does someone rebuild after something that feels like losing themselves? Not by returning to who they were, and not by becoming someone entirely new overnight. Healing begins with reconstruction through presence. This means grounding in small, repeatable realities: sleep, food, routine, movement, and relationships that do not demand performance. It also means resisting the urge to immediately assign a spiritual explanation to every emotional wave. Meaning may eventually emerge, but it cannot be forced without distortion. Neuroscience supports this. Research on trauma and identity suggests the brain rebuilds coherence through repeated safe experiences. Identity is not a fixed object. It is a pattern the brain learns to stabilize over time. And yet something deeper is also happening beneath the neurological layer. Many spiritual traditions interpret ego death not as destruction, but as deconstruction, the stripping away of inherited identities, conditioning, and emotional survival masks. What remains is not emptiness. It is potential without shape. But potential without grounding can feel like loss. So healing becomes a dual process, rebuilding the nervous system, while slowly allowing a new sense of self to emerge, one that is less reactive, less defensive, and more aligned with internal truth rather than external expectations. There will be moments when the old identity tries to return. Familiar thoughts, familiar fears, familiar narratives about who you should be. This is normal. Integration is not linear, it is recursive. And then, almost quietly, something shifts. Not a dramatic transformation, not a sudden enlightenment, but a subtle return of continuity, where life no longer feels like it is happening to a stranger. That is the sign that healing after ego death is taking root. Not that you became someone else, but you learned how to exist without abandoning yourself in the process. Healing after a traumatic ego death is not about rebuilding the old identity or escaping into a new one. It is about integrating what was shattered into something more stable, more conscious, and more real. As Jungian psychology, trauma research, and transpersonal studies all suggest in different ways, The collapse of the ego is not the end of identity. It is the beginning of reconstruction. And through grounded living, nervous system safety, and patient integration, what emerges is not a lost self, but a more authentic one taking shape.